Hello, everyone. Welcome to our special event for the annual members meeting for YWCA Canada. We are today in a Zoom meeting, so not a Zoom webinar. So I'm going to kindly ask everyone that as soon as you arrive into the room, please please mute your microphone just so we don't get any feedback. So I do hear a couple folks, their audio. So if you could kindly just mute your microphone, that would be fantastic. As folks are coming in, I encourage you to read the slide right now, which is YWCA Canada's Mutual Respect Protocol. In a few seconds, you'll see a poll that'll be launched. If you could kindly acknowledge and affirm that you agree with the mutual respect protocol, that would be fantastic. So we still have a couple folks coming in, so we're going to start in just a sec. But as people are here, please mute your microphone. I can still hear some feedback. And please also acknowledge the mutual respect protocol. This is an event of YWCA Canada, and we always encourage people to share our events on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. So our social media platforms are there. I'm also gonna ask the hashtag YWAM20. So I'm still seeing, or I'm still hearing my voice. So I think there's feedback. So if folks can just mute their microphone, that would be fantastic. Okay, so I've muted everyone, so hopefully address it. Great. So again, welcome to our special event, Preventing a Lockdown Generation. This is an event that's proudly hosted by YWCA Canada's Young Women's Leadership and Engagement Committee, also known as YLEC. In a couple moments, you'll hear more about that specific committee. And this event is actually part of our annual members meeting. So I know a lot of folks on the call right now are part of the YWCA community, but we also have a lot of folks who are not part of the YWCA community, hopefully soon though. So this is actually a special event that we've actually opened up to the broader public. So we're really, really happy and thrilled to have you here. And we hope you learn a bit about the YWCA community through this event and encourage you to engage with us in the work that we do across the country in many, many communities. My name is Anjum Sultana, and I'm the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently situated in Toronto, also known as Tuckaronto, which is covered by Treaty 13, as well as the Williams Treaties, and is also subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. I encourage folks in the chat, introduce yourselves, say who you are, how you identify, where you're situated. We'd love to know. So please do indicate that. And if you want, you can also change your display name to put your pronouns, which we really encourage. Speaking of, the land I'm situated on, we're currently meeting virtually. And as we are connecting virtually, we often like to ensure that we first acknowledge and honor the first peoples of this land who have been on Turtle Island for time immemorial. We also recognize the harm and legacy of settler colonialism that does still infringe on the rights of Indigenous communities, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also often like to talk about at YWCA Canada around how do we make virtual spaces as anti-oppressive and as safer as possible. As more of us spend time online due to COVID and staying safe from COVID and respecting public health protocols, we recognize that digital spaces are not always safe, especially in terms of the experiences of Black, Indigenous, racialized communities, people living with disabilities, sexual minorities, newcomers, immigrants, refugees, migrants, and other communities, diverse equity-seeking communities that experience intersecting forms of marginalization. So let's do our part to make this space as safe as possible in the way we speak to one another, how we interact with one another, and I appreciate your cooperation on this front. So today we have a bit of a packed agenda with many exciting conversations around how we can prevent a lockdown generation. So we'll be having opening remarks by Peggy Chen, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We'll have a panel discussion with just incredible thought leaders in our YWCA movement. We have national office board members, member association board members, member association staff members, and many people who have interacted with the YWCA community. So you'll get a sense of the work that we do and how we think about the issues around preventing a lockdown generation. We'll also open it up to Q&A. Throughout the conversation, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat and I'll see how I can integrate. And towards the end of the conversation, we'll also have a Q&A where, depending on how things go, there may be an opportunity for you to not only ask your question in the chat, but potentially verbally ask it by unmuting your microphone. So I'll let folks know when that opportunity arises. And then we'll have some closing remarks around, what we do next. So the hope of this event is not that it just stays in the dialogue and discussion, but it also translates into action. And we really are looking forward to working with all of you to inform the work that we do at YWCA Canada and what comes next around how do we prevent a lockdown generation. And so with that, I also would like to just let folks know about a bit of housekeeping. So first, this event is being recorded. We're going to be posting it on YWCA Canada's YouTube account next week. And we'll also send that link out to everyone who registered for this event. In case folks would like to revisit the conversation. We currently have English to French interpretation. So for folks, if you want to check on your Zoom bar at the bottom, if you click interpretation, you'll be able to select the language that you'd like to receive the audio from this event. So please leverage that option as folks want. We also have closed captioning. So again, on the bottom toolbar for Zoom, if you click on closed captioning, you should be able to get a live transcript of the conversation. So currently that's activated, so you'll have that opportunity. Right now, it is currently just for English captioning. We endeavor after the event to translate the French interpretation into closed captioning as well when we upload to our YouTube account. So just so folks know. I had mentioned already the Q&A, so please use the chat function for the Q&A. I'd love to encourage you to live tweet this event. We're really grateful to Sarah Hannaford, who's live tweeting the event right now from YWCA Canada. We encourage you to retweet what we put out on our account and use the hashtags if you're tweeting as well, preventing a lockdown generation, as well as YWAM 21. So now that we've kind of talked about how we'll engage in the space and what we're going to be talking about, I want to bring on stage my colleague and YWCA Canada's National Office Board member, Peggy Chen. And Peggy Chen has a very long and robust history with the organization. Peggy is our co-chair of the YWCA Canada's Young Women's Leadership and Engagement Committee, also known as YLAC. And in this work, along with Deanne Howlett, who's also on our panel today, she works with young women and non-binary youth across the national YWCA movement on mentorship, advocacy, and capacity building initiatives. Peggy has been involved with the YWCA movement for the last 7 years and currently as board member of YWCA Canada, and has been doing incredible work around gender advocacy and youth leadership at local, national, and international levels. So Peggy, I'd like to bring you on stage. You want to share a few opening remarks?
Yes. Thank you so much, Anjem, and hello to everyone joining us today. Welcome to those of you who are a part of the YWCA Canada movement, joining us as part of the annual members meeting. And also a big welcome to those of you joining us as partners and community mobilizers as we have our discussion today. My name is Peggy Chen and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm grateful to be joining you all today from Vancouver, BC, which is on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. So as Anja mentioned, I am a board member of the YWCA Canada, and through this role, I also have the great privilege of co-chairing the Young Women's Leadership and Engagement Committee, otherwise known as the YWCA, and we're very happy to be presenting this event today. As part of a pan-Canadian organization with over 30 local member associations, our role in the committee is really to center the voices of young women and gender diverse youth in our YWCA movement. The purpose of YWCA is to prioritize and facilitate young women's engagement and leadership opportunities at all levels of the YWCA, where young women can share power as leaders and decision makers. We lead capacity building initiatives and also facilitate connections such as this one for young women in our movement. And we also support young women's attendance in leadership at YWCA events. So our membership spans from coast to coast and is made up of YWCA staff and volunteers. So if you're listening right now as a member of the YWCA, you too can join the YWCA and support our work in centering youth voices in the movement. So I'm really excited to be having this discussion with our colleagues today about preventing a lockdown generation because I think it is so timely. I know that COVID cases are still quite varied across different provinces and communities, but speaking from here in BC, our provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, has said that BC could be in a post-pandemic world by the end of the summer if everything goes well. So that's very soon. And when I first heard of this, of course, I felt relief knowing that the pandemic will be over soon. Our families and our elders and our communities will be safe. But there was also a small part of me that felt a little bit of uncertainty, not knowing what a post-pandemic world would look like. I know for sure that they won't be the same as pre-pandemic times, and that very likely will be again adjusting to a new normal. We know that the impacts of the pandemic on young people is systemic and disproportionate. So it is quite scary to think about how we will recover from the fallouts from the past 15 or 16 months or so. Outside of the YWCA, I work in the K-12 public school system. And while students have stayed resilient through these challenging times, they are also experiencing an economic crisis at a very formative period of their lives and missing out on many opportunities. So even though COVID cases are declining here, I'd say that mental health and well-being also are still declining. And youth has shared with me their anxieties about just being out in the world again and putting themselves out there. There's anxiety about making friends and connecting again. A lot of uncertainty about volunteering and what job prospects are looking like. And this is after a full school year, which has already been very isolating for a lot of young people. So as we head into a post-pandemic world, here's some of the things I'm thinking about. Linking to the purpose of our Young Women's Leadership and Engagement Committee, how can we continue to share power and to center the voices of young women as leaders, both in and outside the YWCA movement? With gender justice and generational equity in mind, how do we remove the barriers for equity-seeking groups to be heard and represented in leadership and decision-making? And finally, how do we keep leaders accountable to policies and practices that uniquely impact our generation? I know that our panelists will be covering some of these topics and we're in for a very thoughtful discussion. So I'll stop there. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And I'll turn it back to you, Anjum.
Thanks so much, Peggy. That was great. And just continuing the conversation now on what is a lockdown generation and what was the kind of thinking behind this. So very early on in the pandemic, the YWCA movement from coast to coast to coast was really seeing the diverse gendered impacts of this crisis, especially looking at it through an intersectional feminist lens. Everything from economic opportunities to the impacts on gender-based violence to the rise in housing unaffordability and homelessness. On so many different issues, we were seeing the gendered impacts across the board. And then when you layered on different identities, we saw folks who were already marginalized before the pandemic were experiencing further and deeper marginalization. And one of the things that we haven't seen in Canada enough conversation about is the generational aspect of this crisis. So just to kind of give you one specific statistic that when I heard, it just like made me so afraid, but also hopeful that if more people heard about this, then maybe we can start to have a dialogue and conversation and then action. So a statistic looking just specifically on the impacts of Gen Z women in this pandemic. So Gen Z women make up 2.5% of Canada's labor force, but they experience 17% of the total job losses. So that just shows you when we're talking about the gendered impacts of this crisis, if you don't put a generational lens, we'll not see that. Those are the communities who've been deeply impacted. Young workers, young women are often disproportionately represented in the sectors that have been hardest hit, like hospitality, tourism, retail. And so we need to have a generational focus. Unfortunately, despite the dire generational impacts of this crisis, when we hear about young people so far through the pandemic, it's been through this negative frame, not only around how they've been impacted economically, socially, mental health concerns and challenges, but also as vectors of disease. And this is something we want to challenge. We want to challenge this narrative because what we've actually seen in this crisis and within the YWCA movement and beyond is that young people have been leading. They have been at the forefront of social movements and mutual aid networks. And in fact, looking at volunteering numbers, younger generations have actually accelerated their volunteering during the pandemic through formal and informal means. So we really need to think about young people as agents of change because that's the work they've been doing during the last 15, 16 months. And so for us, we wanted to have this conversation to unpack not only the impacts on young people through an intersectional feminist lens, but also the opportunities that young people bring to us as a movement within the YWCA and also for the rest of the country in the work that we can do. So with that, I'd like to introduce on stage our incredible panelists. So if you'll just give me a moment to share with you a bit about our lovely colleagues. That is what I'll do. And as I'm introducing my colleagues, I'll ask them to take off turn on their video so we can hear more about them as we bring them on stage. So first up is Deanne Howlett, who is also a co-chair of the YLA committee. Deanne completed her bachelor's in social work in 2015 and bachelor's of arts in 2016, and currently holds the title of program manager at YWCA St. John's. And she's worked in various capacities there since 2014 and has done incredible work around project management, program development, and building rewarding collaborations within community. Before the YWCA in St. John's, Deanne volunteered and completed field placements in a number of St. John's direct service agencies. And if you ever want to have a great conversation with Deanne, so many things you can talk about, but she really enjoys a good book and is a real reality TV aficionado. So thank you and welcome, Deanne. I'd also like to bring on stage Sharon Ishiwememe, who is a first-generation immigrant and settler in Mi'kma'ki. She came to Halifax, Nova Scotia from Kampala, Uganda 4 years ago to attend the Master's of Public Relations degree at Mount St. Vincent University, where she graduated as valedictorian. Congratulations. She's currently on the board of YWCA Halifax and has worked in communications both in Uganda and Canada. and is currently the Innovation Engagement Manager at the Organization for Nova Scotia Innovation-Driven Entrepreneurship. So welcome, Sharon, who's also very passionate about entrepreneurship, connecting people, and has a superpower of spotting the silver linings. Very similar to me. Great to have you here, Sharon. Next up, we have Renata Hugbert, who grew up in Belgium and Saskatchewan, and is a strategic communication specialist and nonprofit professional dedicated to community building, has a Bachelor's of Commerce from the University of Saskatchewan, based in Ottawa, and currently works at the Canadian Medical Protective Association in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She's been volunteering with the YWCA for quite some time. And this was after she received a Women of Distinction Award in 2017. She spent 2 years on the board of YWCA Saskatoon, and I'm really happy to share that she is one of our newly elected board members at the National Office for YWCA Canada. Welcome, Renata. Next up, we have Violetta Nikolskaya, who is a senior analyst from YWCA Hamilton, joined the movement back in 2017 as a manager of transitional housing, so great subject matter expertise there. Did lots of work around frontline service management, the shelter housing and support programs. Violetta also serves as the vice chair for the LGBTQ advisory committee for the city of Hamilton, so very involved in her community in the city of Hamilton. And also serves on the Homelessness Advisory Committee. Violetta completed her Master's of Critical Social Work at McMaster University, and her thesis was focused on the homeless service sector. In her free time, plays different video games, including Animal Crossing, so definitely ask Violetta about that next time you chat with her. And finally, last but not least, we have Riley Daku, who is a strong leader at YWCA Saskatoon and has done incredible work around delivering supports and services to women, children, and families as the Director of Operations for the YWCA of Saskatoon. Still under the age of 30, Riley earned her CPA designation and became a member of the senior management team at 25. And is currently the co-chair of the Capacity Building Subcommittee. When she's not at work, Riley loves spending time with her family and friends, exploring the outdoors with her husband and 2 dogs. So with that, I'd like to start the conversation. So I'm just going to bring up all of our colleagues as a spotlight, so you'll see everyone all at once. And my first question is going to go to Deanne. And Deanne, it's about your expertise around employment and training programs. And so, we talked a bit, young people, especially young women, have been hardest hit with the pandemic, experiencing increased rates of layoffs, unemployment, challenges with getting decent work. So not just any job, but a decent job. And so, at YWCA St. John's, you're doing a lot of the work around program delivery and employment programs for young people, gender diverse youth, and young women especially. How do we address this employment crisis in Canada for young people so young people are not locked away from opportunities and left behind?
Thanks so much, Anjum. I'm really excited to be here today, joining you from the ancestral homeland of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and really honored to share space with everyone who's part of this important discussion. It's a topic I care quite a lot about, and I really don't see a way forward through our current economic crisis without prioritizing the needs of young women and gender diverse youth in this country. So when I first think about the impact that COVID is having on young people's access to employment in particular, I think directly about the challenges that were presenting themselves even before COVID came to be. So young people were already facing higher levels of underemployment as more entry-level jobs were requiring higher education or more years of experience. And we also know that most young people kind of expect to walk into precarious work at the outset of their working lives. Job insecurity is kind of is something that is really present for many of the early years of young people's working lives. And these challenges are further exacerbated for young Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, women living with disabilities, as well as newcomer women. So Early when the pandemic started, Choices for Youth, which is a local youth serving agency in Newfoundland and Labrador, actually surveyed about 486 youth in the province to get a sense of how COVID was impacting them. And through this survey and through these connections they made, 61% of the respondents had indicated being unemployed, but 72% of those 61% were young people that were unemployed as a direct result of COVID. And 53% of the youth they surveyed also indicated that their employment and career goals were changing directly because of COVID-19. And I know this information isn't shocking, it's something we kind of know, but I think it's just really indicating our need to invest in youth employment to ensure that young women and gender diverse youth aren't locked away from the opportunities you've mentioned, Anjum. So in the midst of COVID, YWCA St. John's actually teamed up with YWCA Halifax and YWCA Moncton to deliver Launch Atlantic in each of our provinces, which is an employment program for young women and gender diverse youth. It's 7 weeks of paid employability skills training and 12 weeks, a 12-week paid work experience. And there were a few interesting things that I noticed in our delivery of that program in St. John's. One being that the diversity of experience of the participants was really broad. So we had folks with master's degrees, folks who had never worked before, and folks who had never finished high school. So it made it really clear that young women and gender diverse youth are struggling to access employment regardless of what their resume looks like. Two, the opportunity to get connected to employers and get your foot in the door, show off your skills, and build on your resume is a huge necessity right now. We know that because of COVID, there's way fewer opportunities to connect with potential employers and mentors since community spaces and in-person events and services aren't really happening in the same way. So being able to come into a program where you can demonstrate kind of proof of what you can contribute to an employer was really valuable. And it indicates that creating jobs and opportunities for employment and skill development are really essential in this time for young people. And I think we're also just hearing in terms of the feedback from the program is the immense impact that the program is having in terms of boost of confidence and sense of self through engaging in like a person-centered trauma-informed program and having someone kind of cheerlead you on throughout the process, because looking for work is so frustrating and really challenging and can have an impact on your mental health. I also wanted to mention that in 2019, YWCA St. John's actually worked on a project called Opportunity Knocks. We held a community symposium, this is pre-pandemic, that focused on exploring solutions to career and employment challenges facing women of diverse cultural and racial backgrounds in Newfoundland and Labrador. And recently, the Community Employment Collaboration in Newfoundland and Labrador that convenes employment program deliverers, career development practitioners all in one space, they actually did some research around the experiences of job seekers who identify as ethnically, culturally, or racially diverse. And what both of these projects kind of really highlight that show pre and post pandemic, racism is consistently a barrier to employment, and mentorship opportunities can support folks in getting their foot in the door. So based on that, I really think two other key solutions that we need to focus on are building mentorship opportunities for young women and gender diverse youth that really ensure these opportunities are accessible to racialized and Indigenous young women in our communities. And the other is doing anti-racist work in our own organizations. I don't think we can work on addressing this issue with employers that are potentially communicating with us through employment programs or even us just pointing the finger at them. We all have a role in this, and I think we have to do the internal work in our MAs or organizations ourselves. Yeah.
Excellent point, Dan. And so many promising practices and actions that we as organizations and as individuals can take. I really appreciated your point around mentorship. I think too often we forget about the importance of social capital, and that's something that's harder to build during a pandemic. It's one thing to do a networking event pre-pandemic where you can see people in person. How do you do that in a COVID kind of world? So I think that's something we need to all keep in mind. So thank you. Next, I want to pass it over to Violetta. So another big issue impacting young people during this pandemic has been around accessing affordable housing and also the rise of homelessness. And so, your work at YWCA Hamilton, you've done extensive work in the sector, especially through an anti-oppressive lens. And so I'm wondering, we've seen homelessness, especially, and unaffordability really impact Black, Indigenous, racialized youth, people living with disabilities, newcomers, and many folks from diverse equity-seeking groups. So my question is, how do we ensure people aren't left behind when it comes to housing in this country, especially young people?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. And I'm answering this question on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. We must all unequivocally fight the commodification of housing. Whether you stand to make a lot of money, or you just squeezed your way into the market, all of us must take a firm stance to advocate for affordable, safe, and environmentally friendly housing, and to push back against the unethical practices around the housing market. To borrow language from Carlson Leung and Faye Williams, the global financialization of the housing markets has transformed a fundamental human right into a commodity. You can't have it both ways. You can't preach for affordable housing while capitalizing on the injustice that permeates this market. A majority of young people can only afford a parking space, a storage unit, or an RV at this point. The housing landscape is even harder for gender diverse, Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, newcomers, and two-spirit LGBTQIA+ communities. And this is because the discrimination within the private market, be it you are a buyer or a seller or a renter, continues to exist and are even further exacerbated as the demand runs high, allowing bigots to go unchecked in their actions. An example of this actually recently hit the news. A Black woman in the United States had her home appraised, but when she had it appraised for a second time, but the appraiser thought that the home was owned by a white woman, he appraised it at twice the initial value. Don't think for a second that this doesn't occur in Canada as well. So young people, especially gender diverse youth, face so much discrimination during the rental process. And the process to seek justice in those situations could cost thousands of dollars and take up to 6 months at the Human Rights Tribunal. Once upon a time, the generation fondly known as boomers could purchase their starter home upon completing high school at a price that was around 3 or 4 times their annual salary. They could qualify for a mortgage, they could pay it off quickly. For young people today, following post-secondary education and establishing themselves in their careers, they'll be faced with a housing price market that is over 8 to 12 times their annual salary. They simply cannot even qualify for a mortgage competitive enough for the housing market. And renting? Well, average one-bedroom prices for most cities in which people's employment is located in is creeping close to 45% of their monthly income. We've lost the middle in the housing continuum. Starter homes are now priced the same as luxury homes were in 2014. I want to share a couple facts. There are several industries that contribute the most to the Canadian GDP, or gross domestic product. Construction contributes about $140 billion to the Canadian GDP, but that's only the 5th highest industry. Mining and oil and gas extraction is in 3rd place. Manufacturing is in 2nd place. But do you know what's in 1st place, almost doubling construction? You guessed it, real estate and rental and leasing, contributing $264 billion as noted in December of 2020. That's a problem. House prices in Canada doubled from 2000 to 2014, and then doubled again from then to 2020, which outpaced every country in the world. Here's another fact. In Toronto, there are more than 66,000 empty homes. And in fact, there are over 1 million empty homes across Canada. They're owned by investors, and they're sitting and they're waiting to make the crisis worse. Another fact is that there are roughly 235,000 people experiencing homelessness in Canada today. That's a ratio of 1 person to 4 empty homes. Housing and homelessness is a very complex issue, but a lot of the solutions are obstructed because it is a profitable market for those in power. We must all take down those barriers together, at the very least for the benefit of the youth of the next generation.
Yeah, very powerful call to action and very, very insightful examples. And I think, this has been, for a lot of young people, like it's this quote unquote, like how to advance in your life, right? Like housing is such a key part of that, and it's becoming more and more difficult to access. So I think it's something incumbent on all generations to really support the next generation in accessing this essential shelter, right? So I want to now kind of transition to, what does this employment crisis and housing crisis mean for young people on their health and well-being? And Riley, I'm going to come to you for this question. This, employment concerns and housing concerns, that pays a toll on young people, on their mental health and well-being. And I was wondering if you could share a bit about, what you've seen in your work as a director of operations at YWCA Saskatoon, and, how do we promote well-being for young people? What do we need to invest in? And, are there things that we could do in workplaces to address this as well?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anjum. I'm very excited to be a part of this panel, just like my other panelists. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis. Mental health is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, both work perspective and professional. And I think as someone who is close to not quite being a youth anymore, considered, I'm really passionate about being able to provide our young people with the skills that they need to successfully tackle the world. I'm very excited to be having this conversation. I think that the mental health problem in our youth is not new, and we all know that, but COVID's definitely put a spotlight on it, which hopefully, is increasing the conversation around it, which hopefully allows folks to feel more comfortable and safe asking for help. So in the end, I think that's our goal, is to make it a more comfortable topic. I think our youth today are facing lots of challenges that we didn't face, and the boomers generation didn't face. We have such an increase in technology. We as a society are as connected as we've ever been, yet stats say that we're the loneliest we've ever been. We know that young people are affected largely by anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts, and this isn't new. This isn't something that came with COVID. This has been happening for a long time now. Through COVID, young people report greater instances of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicidal thoughts than any of the other generations. And as young people navigate their way in the world, they haven't yet developed the coping mechanisms that come with age and experience. So in other words, young people lack the life experience that let them know that difficult situations won't last forever. With isolation that our youth have experienced over the past 15 months, the situation has become worse. Our young people don't have the support of others. They don't have their friends and family close. They don't have the dependable teacher that they can go to. They've become more isolated, and as people who support them, we've lost our ability to support them in the ways that they need to be supported. I think with a generation that already feels isolated and lonely, largely due to technology, this has only increased over COVID. And I don't want to give technology a super bad rap. It's not all bad. I think it's been amazing to see our young people throughout the pandemic, the resourcefulness they have. They were able to pivot and learn and interact with each other in new ways, whether that was through FaceTime, party rooms, virtual celebrations, or support groups. There's been some amazing and creative things that have occurred, but of course, this is still not ideal, and it doesn't replace physical interactions. I've seen some positive things in Saskatoon that I know is replicated across the country. We have a lot of agencies that are offering online support, online counseling, support groups, which provides access to those folks that wouldn't typically have access or maybe feel comfortable having access. So I think that's very positive, and I think it's something that will hopefully continue. I do also think it's very important for rural communities to be able to access this, and this has been a support that I think has benefited that greatly. Some positives, I think, for students who maybe suffer from bullying or social anxiety, online learning has been really great. However, I think that a bigger percentage of the youth have suffered from this and withdrawn and felt more isolated. I think of the adjustment to university and how big of a role my peers played in that, with allowing me to adjust, feeling comfortable creating those bonds and that support group. And I think of how hard that adjustment would be without those things. So I think that so many of those little life experiences are really adding to the mental health challenges that our youth face. I'd love to see that I've seen a ton more promising practices, and I don't want to be cynical, but this isn't a new issue that we're facing. And I think as a society, we need to do a better job of providing our youth with coping mechanisms and perspectives. There's definitely a lot more we can do. At workplaces, I think it's really important now more than ever for staff to have access to an EAP program. I think we should increase staff education. We were very fortunate at the Y Saskatoon to have all of our staff attend a mental health first aid training. I know in the past, this is typically something that would be focused on frontline workers, those working with shelter folks, for example, in our association. But I found incredible benefits from it being a program or a training that all staff had access to. I learned so many things from that program, and just awareness being one of the biggest things that allow me to deal with people in my personal life and colleagues in just a better way. I think that things like that should become not mandatory, but more common practice moving forward. I think that all ages struggle with mental health, and COVID has just put a spotlight on this, but it's our youth that are really the most vulnerable. I think it's really important as we mature and get older to remember just how much you've developed throughout your life, the skills that you develop as you mature. It might sound like common sense, but as we get older with anything else, once we're removed from the situation, we lose our perspective and our ability to relate to others from their point of view. Losing your ability to play your final year of high school sports might not sound like a big deal, but that 17-year-old, for that 17-year-old, this is an experience they'll never be able to get back, and they don't know what else life still has waiting for them. From our perspective, we can see that things get better, but it's hard when you haven't had those life experiences to look past that. As we approach the end of the physical measures, finally in sight, and Saskatchewan, I think July 11th is the possibility of masks off, increased gathering size. I think it's really important to also remember that this doesn't mean that COVID's going to end. History has shown that the mental health impact of disasters far outlasts the physical impact, meaning that today's elevated mental health need is only going to continue past the COVID-19 outbreak. I like to provide a little example here. I was one of those fortunate folks that got to get married during COVID. So I planned many versions of a COVID wedding, but in the end, we ended up eloping, which was perfect, and I loved it, and it was a great experience. But since then, as I see people's pictures of family pictures of weddings, as I see people celebrating, I get a little bit triggered just in what I've missed out. And I think that's a very small example of what people will continue to face over the next couple of years, of things that they've missed out on. And I think it's important to remember that folks are going to deal with these situations very differently. And as support systems in people's lives, I think it's important to remember that any way of dealing with these things is very valid, and we need to be very accepting of that. So I think there's a lot of work that's going to come with mental health, and it's not something that's new, but I really appreciate the conversation that's come out of this, and hopefully it'll help with our support. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Riley. And I think, yeah, just recognizing the trauma that this time will carry on, and how we need to, if we should be thinking in a more preventative fashion, but also thinking about what kinds of systems and supports do we need to put in place now and for years to come. So thank you for sharing, and also sharing a bit on the personal level too. And so, we've heard about, the impacts of this crisis on young people when it comes to employment, when it comes to housing, when it comes to mental health. And so, Sharon, a question that I have for you is, this is challenging. And I think sometimes, when people think about young people in this country, they see it as a small group, but millennials are the largest generation. They make up 27% of our population here in this land. And also, young people are becoming increasingly more diverse. Indigenous young people are the fastest growing population in this country. When it comes to immigration, many of the people that are immigrating to this country are young newcomers, international students, and so we're seeing, young people are a significant population. They're a very diverse population. And so I'm wondering, how do we ensure young people feel a sense of belonging in our workplaces, in our communities, in our country? Where do you see us going, and where can we go, Sharon?
That's a great question, Anjum. And I must acknowledge that I feel really honored to be joining this panel of very, very wise women. And I'm joining from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I would be remiss if I answered this question without taking a moment to acknowledge the 215 children who were found dead in Kamloops. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the 4 family members who were killed in a hate crime just a couple of days ago, because we are talking about belonging, and sections of the population are just so disposable. I sit at the intersection of so many factors that lead to marginalization as a Black woman who also happens to be a newcomer in a really huge country. But moments like these remind me to think about my own privilege and to recognize that there are groups of people that are suffering in ways that I could never even imagine or even try to understand. So I thought I needed to take a moment to just acknowledge those things because we are talking about Indigenous youth, we are talking about people who look different from others. I'd like us to also think about the fact that we are human before we become anything else. And there are feelings that are universal to all human beings, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, how old they are. Feelings like joy, feelings like sadness, and belonging happens to be one of those feelings. And simply put, belonging is feeling like you are an important or essential part of something. So how can we help young people feel like they belong in our workplaces, in our communities, and in our country? I would say make them an essential part of your workplace. If we look at the groups of people that have most been impacted by the pandemic, for example, the people who lost their jobs very early on in the pandemic, these are the people that we are talking about, because a lot of times, even when they get hired, they're hired in positions that are disposable. So when budgets are low, guess who's going to lose their job first? It is those people. So if we really care about having them within our organizations and them feeling like they belong, then we should make them essential parts of those organizations. Now, you might be wondering, why should I make a young person and give them a big position, for example, or a person who just came to Canada? Let me tell you something. The business case for diversity is clear. When you have people who are different, who come from different places, who are of different ages, who are different genders, who are have different experiences, then you have better governance, you have better decision making, you have disruptive innovation happening because of the collision of ideas happening. So there is no question about whether those people will perform, because they will. The only times that they will not perform are times when you hire them just for you to look good as an organization. In those cases, you end up hiring the wrong candidate because you just want to fill the position. And what happens when you do something like that is that you actually re-emphasize the stereotype that makes people think that a certain group of people cannot do well. But if you actually hire right and give people the right resources to do their work, and you're not just trying to look good, but you're actually working on doing good, then people will do well. So the focus should be actually inclusion instead of diversity. And there's one thing that I have noticed. I've been very privileged. I've only lived in this country 4 years, but a lot of CEOs, a lot of people have opened doors for me. So my conclusion is that the leaders of organizations are actually well educated about inclusion. They want to have young people in their organizations. They want to have people who don't look like everyone else being part of their organizations. Unfortunately, those are not the people we work with on a daily basis. They're not the people I will run into when I go into the kitchen. They're not the people that are staying away from me during the lunch break. So there is need for education for everyone within the organization so that the organization is learning together as a whole. That is the only way that people who don't look like everyone else will feel like they belong within the organizations and therefore stay. Because when they don't feel like they belong, they leave. When I walk into a place and I'm not welcome, I will find the next place that makes me feel like I am welcome. So for our communities, it is important to also recognize that people are different, and that is not a bad thing. Difference isn't to be feared. It isn't to even be accommodated. It is to be celebrated because it's beautiful. And because, like I've stated in the business case, it's also good for our communities when we are not the same. So what happens is that a lot of times communities talk about integration. And when we talk about integration, we talk about it as something that should be done to the people who are different from everyone else, instead of something that should be done with the people. So we are asking our question, how do we integrate young people? How do we integrate newcomers? How do we integrate Muslims, for example? The question should be, how can we work together to help them integrate within our communities? Because when we look at integration from our own lens, what we are thinking about is very different from what the person that you're trying to help feel like they belong. It's very different than what they are thinking about. So I think that we need to think about our integration strategies for that matter and make sure that the people that we are trying to bring in are actually leading the charge. If I may use my own example, if you met me 1.5 years ago, I was a totally different person. I use the analogy that I continue to do the same, that I am building this bicycle while I ride it, because I am learning about, I'm learning to speak English. I've spoken English all of my life, and I thought I spoke it pretty well. My grades were always the best in the English language classes at school. And then I got here and realized that I don't speak English, because every time I said anything, still happens, people ask me to repeat myself. So you're learning how to speak, you're learning how to communicate, if I may, you're learning about finances in a new place. I never had a credit card until I got here. You're learning so many things, that the things that are important to the people seeing you from the outside may look like they are neglected. You're not neglecting them, you're not ignoring them. It just takes time for you to learn things, and I don't think that my own learning will ever end. I also thought I should mention that we need to be open to difference generally. One thing that people tell me all the time is that Canada needs more people like you. I think it's supposed to be a compliment, but it actually isn't, because it makes me think that you're saying that because you know things about me that people I meet on the street or on a bus don't know about me. And if you didn't know those things, you probably wouldn't say Canada needs more people like me. I think Canada needs all kinds of people. And if I found myself in a difficult situation, I don't think that I would try to separate myself from the others, because I think that if I did, then I would be saying those people shouldn't be here, or they shouldn't be in the spaces that they are in. So I think that we have to be open to difference and celebrate it, but also recognize that we are learning, that we didn't know the things that we didn't know 10 years ago. There are things we don't know now that 10 years from now, we will wonder what we were thinking. If we go after perfection instead of improvement, for example, then we are not helping the situation at all. But if we acknowledge that things are not perfect and we are willing to turn our assumption into questions and our judgments into curiosity, then people who are not like everyone else will start to feel comfortable in different spaces.
Thank you, Sharon, and so many powerful insights and actions that we can take. And I really appreciated your point around making the focus not on diversity, but inclusion, and setting us up for success, and ensuring that the people that we're hoping to work with and just around making workplaces, communities, and the country more inclusive, working in partnership with communities and not ensuring that communities who are experiencing diverse forms of marginalization are leading the charge. So thank you so much, Sharon. Next, I want to go. So Sharon, you shared a bit also about your experiences as a board member of YWCA Halifax. Renata, you also have experience working on the board of member association and now at the national board. So, I'm wondering, how do we make our leadership spaces, our governance spaces more inclusive? And, within the YWCA movement and beyond, what are some promising practices that you've seen?
Excellent. Thank you for that question, Anjum. And also thank you, Sharon, for acknowledging the 215 lives that were stolen from us in Kamloops, BC, and the lives that were just lost in London, Ontario. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Ottawa, which is located on the unceded lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. So I think in my experience, organizations, more often than not, they have the best intentions, but it is still really easy to leave people behind when we're talking about inclusion. And we really need to ask ourselves, how is this meaningful to us, and how can we support inclusion in a valuable way that supports actionable outcomes? I find that for young women and youth, and for anyone for that matter, the first time you step into a leadership or governance space, you sometimes might feel like you have imposter syndrome. And I reflect on my own experience the first time I stepped into a governance role, where I felt really intimidated and in awe of all the expertise around the table. And I felt like I didn't really have the right to contribute, because how could I offer value as opposed to someone with years of expertise? I think it's very common to focus on traditional leadership models. However, I think it's more important to champion lived expertise, lived experience, as well as unique knowledge bases. For example, storytelling, grassroots organizing, and childcare. This is really how we can reimagine and rethink conventional structures and build transformative leadership. It's also really important to be aware of unspoken barriers to entry and support new voices that come to the table. We also need to think about, what does inclusiveness look like in practice? What does safety and support and equity look like for people? But also, what does it feel like? It's important to note that to be inclusive, we can't just talk about the people that we would like to see at the table. We have to speak with them and invite them to participate. I've definitely been around conversations about wanting to include more Indigenous and Black and diverse voices at the table, yet no Indigenous voices or Black voices were present during these discussions. So I think it's really important that we hear directly from the people we consult and gain direct insight on what the barriers to access are. And then it's really up to us to build effective solutions. So I think we must build communication and consultation into all of our initiatives and ensure that we're also building relationships. So inviting people to participate is the first step, and then we need to continue to engage and support. We must also take into account diversity and equitable practices, and ensuring our policies and procedures and services are accessible and accountable. And it's about building a culture of inclusion. And you can only do, and that really requires the participation of all of your levels of governance, as well as building a culture of inclusivity really takes a deliberate effort and dedication. So some of the examples I've seen of good practices are building truth and reconciliation calls to action into your mandate and strategic direction, reflecting on your own unspoken barriers to access and speaking about that as a group, because I feel like there's so much to learn from each other. And especially if you name things out loud, it's easier to build actionable steps for improvement and support. Intuitive listening and learning practice. Ask yourself, what voices are we hearing at the table right now? What voices are not being heard? What voices need to be amplified? Also, one of the things we can do is proactive reviews of our policies and procedures regularly to ensure we're still on track. Inclusive language is so important, and it's also important to recognize that technical language can be intimidating and a barrier to access to some. Also including universal accessibility design standards into your materials and websites. Thinking about your space, is it accessible? How welcoming and safe is it for everyone? Ensuring that your space is inviting and not intimidating. And are we accommodating all identities and experiences? And also thinking about the social, physical, and structural barriers and designing solutions to overcome them. I'd also like to mention power structures and decision-making bodies. Think about, where is the power and privilege held? Who is making the decisions? Who is signing off on decisions? Where are you allocating your resources? For example, your HR committees, your strategic planning committees, are they inclusive? Is it reflective of everyone in your movement? It's also important for us to be aware of unconscious bias and privileges and how we can learn here. And by focusing on strategic inclusion, we really can understand the root causes and systemic issues that lead to exclusion and marginalization. I think we really need to welcome and support our differences and ensure that people feel welcomed by, for example, enhancing our onboarding practices and realizing that ultimately inclusivity is not a check mark. It's an ongoing commitment that will need to be revisited time and time again as we move forward, and really build inclusivity into everything we do. So revisit, review, and recharge. And this way we can ensure that we make tangible impacts. And I definitely think YWCA is doing a very good job in leading in this area. Many of the practices I just mentioned I've experienced at the YWCA, and I think YLEC itself is a great example of the work they're doing in mentorship and capacity building. So those are some of the examples that I've experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. And so many like concrete steps that we can take. And I appreciate also, the point you made about imposter syndrome, the importance of having a culture of inclusion. So thank you so much for sharing. I think, such an incredible panel. Like, I took so many notes. So I hope everyone in the audience is also taking notes, because this is how we can move forward and really address the generational inequities, and just so much food for thought. I have another round of questions that I'll ask everyone to respond to the same question. While I do that, I encourage people in the chat. I've seen such great comments and such great enthusiasm for what our panelists shared. I'll give a chance to do a bit of Q&A right after this round. So if folks can write their question in the chat, that would be great. So the next question I have here, and this is open to everyone, and everyone can jump in. So now that we know what the issues are, what the potential solutions are, what should we be doing as a YWCA movement to prevent a lockdown generation? And if folks can, share like concretely, things that we could do as individual managers, supervisors, leaders, individual member associations, or also like the whole YWCA movement. So I'm gonna go back in the order that we started. So Deanne, I'm gonna first pass it over to you. Any thoughts on this? And if I can ask everyone to keep it to a minute, that would be great.
Sure, I'll be super brief. Okay, thinking about managers, supervisors, and leaders, I think managers and leaders need to find ways to support the prevention of early career burnout, if that's a term I can use. I don't know if that's real, but I'm going to make it one if it isn't. Just thinking about the flexibility that we've had to create in order to adjust to COVID, and needing to make sure that that flexibility continues to exist, and that young women and gender diverse youth early in their careers, they're joining teams at a time when a lot of teams are working remotely, which has its own unique concerns in terms of team building, and really can affect the confidence of young people entering the workforce for the first time. And I also think nonprofits are just as susceptible to feeding into the capitalist mantra of productivity or else. And I think leaders within this sector really have an important role of finding the balance between how do we make sure meaningful work is happening while also balancing that with ensuring the wellness of staff. I do want to quickly mention, or just echoing Riley's comments about the impact of mental health and the importance of, call-in well days or mental health days, or flexibility around sick day usage. And I know YWCA Toronto recently implemented additional sick days related specifically to COVID-19, which I thought was a really great step in terms of supporting staff, given everything that's going on in our world. Just trying to think quickly what else. Another thing I wanted to mention was just making sure that young people are at decision-making tables. So kind of echoing what Renata has shared, and making sure that we actually create space for that. In the movement, we talk a lot about 25% of our boards being young women, but how many MAs are continuing to look at that and make sure that's actually something they're giving attention to? And if it's not being filled, why is it? I think centering the voices of YWLEC, giving the platform like this has been phenomenal to kind of center that work. And hopefully we'll have some things coming out around mentorship. So hopefully the movement can get behind that and support it. And the other thing I wanted to mention was advocating for living wages. I think that's something the movement can really get behind. $15 minimum wage, and then moving up to living wages in all of our provinces.
Thank you, Deanne. That's wonderful. Violetta, over to you.
Absolutely. Just to echo some of the things that Deanne shared, absolutely, living wage, because minimum wage across the country literally barely scratches the low income cutoff. We should be beyond that at this point. But I want us to disrupt two things: disrupt the 9 to 5 and disrupt entry level culture. So let's talk about that. Number one, 9 to 5. Is it really that you have 8 hours worth of work to do every single day? Or is it a project in which you can trust your staff to manage their time as it is managed, like as project oriented? That's a capitalist idea that we all have 8 hours worth of work to do. Could we do, a 4-day work week? Could it be a 6-hour workday? These are the things that we have to ask ourselves. Are we just trying to model the for-profit world, or are we actually working towards the program-oriented things that we do in this culture and in the society that we want to see ahead of us? Gen Z folks are pushing against this. They're not willing to donate 50 years of their life to a 9 to 5 job. And it looks as though, why are young people acting this way? It's because they're tired of capitalism that hasn't served them, has done nothing for them, and in fact, has made it really difficult for them to meet their basic needs. So let's question that. The second one, disrupting entry-level culture. Entry-level positions. How many of you, by a fake show of hands, how many of you have made the joke of like, oh, entry-level jobs, they tell you need 5 to 7 years worth of experience, an Olympic gold medal, and all of these other things? That's a joke because it is super difficult to get into entry-level jobs. Do you know what that's a product of? The last recession. The last recession unfortunately furloughed so many individuals who were in middle management. And in order for them to get back into the workforce, they had to create an artificial amount of jobs that were entry level, but yet had the same eligibility criteria as those middle management positions. And we've been suffering with this for the last 15 years. We have to put an end to this. Young people bring an incredible amount of experience. There are young people between the ages of 15 to 23 that run circles around what I can do. And they're the people who are leading the charge on gender equity, leading the charge on climate change. And yet they're young people. Last time I checked, they don't have 8 years of experience in whatever it is that you think that they need to. Here's my last funny joke. There is the person who created the Raspberry software thingamajiggy. I'm not a tech person, so I don't know a social word. he invented the thing, he invented the technology, and it had only been in existence for 2 years. And he saw a job posting where it asked you to have 8 years of experience in that technology. He was like, that's impossible. And I made the technology. That's where the sort of like entry level fake job description kind of culture comes from. We have to erode it. We have to disrupt it. We can do it in the nonprofit world, and we have to do it within this movement.
Excellent call to action, Violetta. Over to you, Riley.
Thank you, Violetta. I just love your passion, and you always provide such amazing perspectives. To kind of jump on the employment train, I think what I've noticed too in my realm is that a lot of our youth aren't prepared for what it means to be in the working world. I think there's definitely maturity that comes along with it, but I would love to see educational resources, whether it be at university level, high school level, or from agencies like the YWCA that provide these resources to youth and provide them things that school doesn't teach us. Not that doing your taxes is preventing you from doing a lot of things, but I think it's an example of one of the things in the school system that school doesn't teach us, those life resources that we need to move forward. So I'd love to see more capacity building. I think as an organization, we are incredible at supporting our clients, but sometimes we forget that the people struggling are those folks right beside us. So I want to challenge you to think about the staff in your organization, and it's not always about the clients that you serve or the community. Sometimes it's those staff that you need to support and provide those resources to. I also want to just touch on the fact that I love our YWCA national community. I've had the opportunity to attend a couple AMMs, and I'm always so encouraged by the people in the room and how joint we are in moving forward. And sometimes I forget to remember that this isn't a representation of the community. I think our movement is amazing, and we talk about these things and move these things forward, but we forget that we're a small portion of the community, and there's so many businesses and other folks that represent different portions of the community that don't talk about these things. So I think as leaders in our community, we need to do a better job of educating the folks that we work with, whether it be clients or if we're partnering with different companies for employment programs. I think we need to instill our values in them and educate them in these areas and open up this conversation and open it up broader than just the YWCA and the nonprofit, because I think we're very good at having this conversation, but it's those other arenas that it's still silent. So we're always going to face these problems if that continues. The one other thing I just want to touch on from a more practical standpoint is that the YWCA Saskatoon, we implemented a new program for our employees that's through our benefits program, and it allows staff access to counseling services virtually at a reduced cost that allows them to use their benefits. And the first session is actually free. So you get partnered with a therapist from across the country. And I think those services are just so important for our staff to access and have the ability to access, because those services are so expensive and underutilized. I'd like to see more workplaces going to that, and to remember that as a nonprofit, we don't always have to be cheap, right? We need to invest in our staff and invest in our community, and sometimes that requires a financial investment that we just have to be prepared to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. And I appreciated your point around we need to be, doing this great work within the YWCA movement, but also be leaders in the communities that we're part of and working across our sectors. That's excellent. Okay, Sharon, over to you.
Thank you. I think this panel has spoken. They've shared so much wisdom, and a lot of youth out there are speaking. So what piece of advice would I have for everyone here? Listen and pay attention and put into action the things that people are saying, because a lot of wisdom is being shared right now. But I'll share one other thing. A few years ago, I read a quote. I was reading Brené Brown's Dare to Lead, and she quoted an LSE professor who said, many years ago, I'm paraphrasing, many years ago, work was about muscle. Right now, it is about the brain. In the future, work will be about the heart. When I read it years ago, I thought the future is now, because I don't see anything that anyone can do without heart. And guess who has a lot of heart? Young people. The passion with which they are doing everything that they are doing right now, the passion with which they are advocating for things and actually taking action can only be reached with the kinds of hearts that they have. So do you want things done within your organizations? Do you want to see progress? Do you want growth? I say just hire, right? Just hire young people and advocate for them everywhere. Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. I love that. And the future is now, and the panel has spoken. Like, absolutely incredible wisdom. And thank you, Sharon, for sharing your wisdom. Renata, over to you. What should we do as a movement, as organizations, as individuals?
Well, I'll probably echo a lot of the incredible comments that were just shared. I think on a national level, it's really building even deeper frameworks for more connection and communication. I know we've spoken about really knowing and reaching out who the youth is in the movement, because we know they're there, we know they're engaged, we know they're leading, but sometimes we don't know how to connect. So definitely strengthening and building deeper connections. I think on a leadership level with managers and leaders, I think it's really about mentorship, which is something I'm so passionate about, because in every situation and space I've stepped into, I've been very lucky to often have the support of leadership and have them open doors. But I also want to highlight mentorship is a two-way street. That's why I think it's so important. It's because we have so much that we can learn from young people. What everyone just said, it's like there's so much passion, there's so much knowledge, there's new knowledge that we've never even heard before. So if we engage in mentorship and in a two-way reciprocal way, there's so much that we can learn as well. And it's not just about what we can give young people, but also how we can support them. So I think that's very important, and echo all the comments around advocating nationally for a living wage. Also mental health, as others have mentioned, it should be an ongoing part of any of our strategy for young people especially. And yeah, I think making actionable commitments that we follow up on, and from all the knowledge we gain and retaining that knowledge. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, folks. To echo what Sharon said, the panel has spoken. I'm seeing so much enthusiasm in the chat. I'm seeing everyone really passionately speaking about the calls to action that every single speaker has talked about, and just the knockout wisdom, as Aniska shared here too. So we have a question, and this is going to be super rapid fire, and this is open to anyone on the panel. So we talked a lot about on this panel around a minimum wage, increasing that, a living wage. A question here from Isabel from YWCA Montreal is around, how would this change to the minimum wage impact small business owners, and who might encounter difficulties in paying the higher wages? What could be done to help them? So what are some solutions there? Any thoughts across the panel? Violetta, go ahead.
They did the study.
I'm sorry.
Isabel.
My image. Yes, I just wanted to specify that many of the small business, I'm talking micro businesses, are women. So they employ 1-2 persons, and sometimes a sudden rise in the wages might be difficult for them to face. So what could be done to help them? What do you think could be done to help them?
It's an excellent question, and it's actually a question that was really well researched in the prairies in 2010. And what they actually found was that keeping people at a minimum wage or lower actually was more expensive for small businesses in particular. Individuals who worked at a smaller wage oftentimes worked 2 or 3 jobs, oftentimes meaning that they were going on more mental health leaves or they were getting sick, and that was actually impacting the small businesses in which they were employed in. Unfortunately, there were other statistics about how some individuals who were working at positions that were in places in the world where there isn't a mandated minimum wage. Did you know in some states in the United States, minimum wage as a wait staff is $2.73. Those staff, unfortunately, some of them engage in some particular behaviors in order to survive, including stealing from their workplace. That was completely eliminated when positions paid a living wage. When you pay individuals to be able to actually live and prosper, they're happier at work, they stay longer, so you don't have turnover rates that are really prevalent in small businesses. And just yesterday, Chipotle is not a small business, but Chipotle announced that they were going to finally pay their staff a living wage. And what it meant was a 4% increase in their cost of product. So a burrito costs 36 more cents. Would you pay 36 more cents for a product in order to ensure that the person serving you was paid a living wage? The answer is yes. And we can do that for small businesses. Small businesses can absolutely pay a living wage. What they have to do is have good business management to ensure that that cost is sort of separated and balanced amongst their products. It's absolutely achievable. There's capitalist arguments as to why you should keep wages down. Those aren't practical in real life, and small businesses really prosper when everyone is paid a living wage. I'm happy to send more research on this, so feel free. I'll put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me. But it's a really great question.
Yeah, and thank you, Violetta, and please do share the research you mentioned. I think that would be fantastic. And what I will share also is there's also opportunities for government to invest in small business owners to ensure that we incentivize hiring in young people. And I'll say in the European Union, they've actually implemented a youth job guarantee. So anyone 30 and under in the European Union has a guaranteed job, education, or training. And it shows like the role also of government to contribute to this as well. All right, so what an incredible panel. I hope folks took lots of notes. I know I certainly did. And this is exactly the type of conversation we wanted to have at the YWCA, because this is going to be that issue that's going to be with us for the next 10 years if we don't address the impacts on young people during this crisis. So I want to take this time to really thank our incredible panelists, Deanne, Sharon, Renata, Violetta, Riley. I know there's a lot of food for thought and just so much around how do we ensure, supporting people's mental health, how do we address employment and skills training during this time, addressing the crisis of homelessness, ensuring that everyone belongs in our workplaces, in our communities, in our country, and that leadership and governance is also inclusive. So we covered a lot of topics, and I hope this gave folks an understanding of how we as a YWCA movement can prevent a lockdown generation. So again, thank you to our panelists. I also want to say that this is not the end of the conversation. In fact, there will be more happening on this topic. We're actually partnering with our friends at YWCA Canada around how do we prevent a lockdown generation. On International Youth Day, which is coming up on August 12th, we're actually going to be releasing our first report. This conversation was going to be a very helpful input into that report. Next week also, we're going to be sending out an online survey to our movement around what we should be investing in to prevent a lockdown generation. So I really encourage everyone to share your ideas because this is something we're going to be sending to Canada's Minister of Finance and different orders of government. So this is our opportunity to create that systemic change because the pandemic has opened a window, has opened an opportunity. Let's leverage it and create a better future moving forward. So with that, again, thank you. I want to also say this is something our colleagues at World YWCA and World YMCA are also participating in. If you Google www.big6.ca, you can see a bit. The World Health Organization and the United Nations Foundation is actually funding 6 of the largest youth-led organizations, including World YWCA, to push this conversation across the globe. And YWCA Canada is going to be part of this conversation with all of you. I think what I'll say also is many, many, many thanks to the organizers that made this possible, the incredible Young Women's Leadership and Engagement Committee. Many of the members who are part of this panel are part of that committee. I also want to say thank you so much to Peggy and Deanne in particular for your leadership and just pushing the conversation about young people in the movement. It really means a lot. Also, big shout out to Priscilla, who was integral from start to finish of this incredible event, and this would not be possible without Priscilla. Also, member services team, Andrea, Natasha, Rain, Rebecca, Jenny, Hamzia, Sarah, philanthropy team, Aniska, Erica, Mercy. So many people made this possible. So really, really, really thank you. And also to our interpreters who made this event bilingual, and I really, really appreciate your support. So with that, thank you, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, everyone. All right, thanks.